September 2000. A small DVD by mail startup called Netflix walked into Blockbuster's headquarters in Dallas, Texas, and made an offer. They wanted $50 million. That's it. $50 million. And Netflix, all of it, the whole company, the technology, the subscriber list, everything would belong to Blockbuster. Blockbuster's CEO, John Antioco, sat across the table from Reed Hastings. He listened to the pitch. And then, according to the people in that room, he laughed. Not a polite, uncomfortable laugh. He actually laughed at them. Netflix at the moment had about 300,000 subscribers and was bleeding money. Blockbuster had 60 million customers, 9,000 stores worldwide, and was pulling in $6 billion a year. From where Antioco was sitting, turning down that meeting made complete sense. 14 years later, Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy, wiped out entirely by the very company that had laughed out of the room. The last corporate-owned Blockbuster store closed in 2013. There's exactly one Blockbuster left on Earth, in Bend, Oregon. And it exists mostly as a tourist attraction. But here's the thing that most people get wrong about this story. Blockbuster didn't die because it missed Netflix. It died because of what happened after it finally woke up. A series of decisions, internal wars, and one catastrophic boardroom betrayal that killed the one plan that might have actually saved it. This is the story of how Blockbuster went from the most powerful entertainment company in America to a total ghost, and how it happened from the inside out. To understand how Blockbuster collapsed, you have to understand what Blockbuster actually was at its peak. Because it wasn't just a video rental store. It was a monopoly dressed up as a neighborhood business. By 1999, Blockbuster controlled roughly 25% of the entire home video market. In the United States alone, it had 7,700 stores. It was opening a new location somewhere in the world every 24 hours. If you wanted to watch a movie at home on a Friday night, Blockbuster wasn't one option for Americans, it was the only option. And it was extraordinarily profitable, but not for the reasons most people think. It was actually because of the late fees. In 2000, Blockbuster collected approximately $800 million in late fees. That's not a typo. That's $800 million in a single year from customers who forgot to return their tapes on time. That number represented roughly 16% of the entire company's revenue. Blockbuster wasn't really in the entertainment business. It was in the punishment business. And it had built its entire financial model around the assumption that customers would keep accepting it. Spoiler alert, they wouldn't. Meanwhile, in the background, something quiet was happening. Netflix had launched its subscription service in 1999. No late fees, no due dates, DVDs delivered directly to your door. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't even fast, but it solved the one problem every Blockbuster customer had complained about for years, and it was growing, slowly at first, then faster. By 2002, Netflix had 857,000 subscribers. By 2003, it crossed 1 million. Blockbuster's leadership looked at those numbers and felt nothing. What's 1 million subscribers against 60 million customers? It barely even registered. But here's what they weren't looking at. They weren't measuring customer satisfaction. They were measuring customer dependency. And those are two very different things. Blockbuster's customers weren't loyal. They were just trapped. And the moment a real exit appeared, they were going to take it. There was also a structural problem that ran even deeper than the late fees. Blockbuster's relationship with major Hollywood studios was built on a revenue-sharing model. A deal struck in 1998 that allowed Blockbuster to stock far more copies of new releases in exchange for giving the studios a cut of every rental. It was a smart deal when it was signed, but it created a cost structure that was almost impossible to escape. Blockbuster needed high rental volume just to cover its obligations, which meant it needed foot traffic, which meant it needed stores, thousands and thousands of physical stores, each carrying rent, staff, utilities, and inventory. By 2002, Blockbuster was carrying roughly $1 billion in debt, and Viacom, the media giant that acquired Blockbuster in 1994 for $8.4 billion, was starting to get nervous. Viacom's chairman, Sumner Redstone, had never really loved the Blockbuster acquisition. He'd pushed for it, but over the years it had underperformed his expectations, and the emerging digital landscape made him even more skeptical. In 2004, Viacom spun Blockbuster off as an independent public company, essentially cutting it loose. Blockbuster was now on its own, weighed down by debt, facing a rising competitor, and led by a CEO who was finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. That CEO was none other than John Antioco, and to his credit, he did eventually see it. He saw it clearly. He came up with a plan that, by most serious analysis, could have genuinely worked, but seeing the problem and solving it were two completely different things. Because the problem wasn't just Netflix. The problem was the company itself. Its costs, its culture, its investors, and ultimately, the man Antioco's own board would invite into the building to destroy everything he was trying to build. By 2004, John Antioco had finally stopped laughing. He'd watched Netflix subscriber count climb past 2 million. He'd watched a new threat emerge in the form of Redbox. Remember those little red kiosks appearing in grocery store parking lots? You could rent DVDs for $1 a night. He'd watched his own stores post declining same-location sales for the third consecutive year. And he'd finally arrived at the conclusion that most of his board had not yet accepted. The late fee model wasn't just unpopular, it was a death sentence. So Antioco made a decision that in retrospect was genuinely bold. He was going to transform Blockbuster from the inside out. The plan had two major components. First, Blockbuster would eliminate late fees entirely, wiping out the single most hated thing about the brand, the thing that had poisoned customer loyalty for 2 decades. This would cost the company an estimated $400 million in annual revenue. Antioco knew that. He was willing to absorb it. He was willing to absorb it because he believed the customer goodwill it generated and the competitive pressure it would remove from Netflix would be worth more in the long run. Second, and more importantly, Blockbuster would launch its own online DVD subscription service. They called it Blockbuster Online. Same model as Netflix, monthly subscription, DVDs by mail, no due dates. But with one critical advantage Netflix could never match: the physical stores. Antioco's team developed a feature called Total Access, which allowed Blockbuster Online subscribers to return their mail DVDs directly to any Blockbuster store and immediately walk out with a free in-store rental while their next disc was shipped. It was genuinely a brilliant idea. Netflix had no answer for it. None. They couldn't build 7,000 stores overnight. They couldn't offer the hybrid experience. For the first time since Reed Hastings had been laughed out of that Dallas meeting room, Blockbuster had a real structural competitive advantage. And it worked. Almost immediately it worked. When Total Access launched in 2007, Blockbuster Online was signing up subscribers at a rate that alarmed Netflix's own executives. Reed Hastings later admitted in interviews that he was genuinely worried during this period. In a single quarter, Blockbuster added 700,000 online subscribers. Netflix stock dropped, their growth slowed, and inside Netflix offices, there were serious internal conversations about what the response would be if Blockbuster kept accelerating. Barry McCarthy, Netflix CFO at the time, would later say that Total Access was the most serious competitive threat the company had faced. So who were the key people driving this? Antioco was obviously the architect, but he brought in a crucial partner, Blockbuster's president Bob Evans. He helped operationalize Total Access and believed in the hybrid model just as deeply as Antioco did. Together, they were steering a company with massive structural debt, declining store revenue, and a very hostile investor base toward what genuinely looked like a viable future. But there was one problem, a giant man-shaped problem, and that man's name was Carl Icahn. Icahn was one of the most feared corporate raiders in American business history. By 2005, he had acquired a significant stake in Blockbuster, eventually controlling roughly 10% of the company's shares. He hated Antioco. He hated the Total Access strategy. He thought eliminating late fees was reckless and that the online pivot was an expensive distraction. He wanted cost cuts. He wanted the debt paid down. He wanted Blockbuster run like a company in retreat, not one trying to reinvent itself. And Icahn had board seats, which meant he had lots of power. The tension between Antioco and Icahn was not a quiet disagreement. It was a war conducted through press releases, proxy fights, and boardroom confrontations. Icahn publicly called Antioco's compensation, which was a $7.5 million bonus tied to the success of the No Late Fees initiative, unconscionable. He campaigned aggressively against him with other shareholders. By early 2007, right at the exact moment Total Access was gaining real momentum, the board was fracturing. Antioco was winning in the market and losing in the boardroom, and everyone inside the company knew it. The moment of no return came in the summer of 2007. Antioco, exhausted by the political warfare and also unwilling to abandon his strategy under Icahn's pressure, announced he would be stepping down as CEO. He was replaced by a man named Jim Keyes. Keyes had no background in entertainment, no background in tech, and no particular understanding of what Total Access was or why it even mattered. He ran 7-Eleven, the convenience store chain, and his view of Blockbuster's future was, to put it plainly, catastrophically wrong for the moment he was walking into. He would prove that almost immediately. Jim Keyes walked into Blockbuster's Dallas headquarters in the summer of 2007 and almost immediately began dismantling the one thing that was working. Within months of taking over, Keyes made the decision to scale back investment in Blockbuster Online and Total Access. His reasoning, stated publicly and often, was that the online business was too expensive to sustain while the company was carrying so much debt. He wasn't entirely wrong about the debt, but he was catastrophically wrong about the prescription. In a 2008 interview with the Dallas Morning News, Keyes said something that became one of the most quoted lines in business school case studies. He said, and I quote, "I've been frankly confused by this fascination that everybody has with Netflix." He went on to suggest that Netflix didn't have a business model that made sense long term, and that Blockbuster's store network was an asset, not a liability. At the time he said that, Netflix had 7.5 million subscribers and was growing year over year by 25%. Keyes began redirecting Blockbuster's strategy back toward the physical stores. The very stores that were hemorrhaging money. The very stores whose foot traffic had been declining for 4 consecutive years. He invested in adding consumer electronics and other retail merchandise to Blockbuster locations, trying to reposition them as general entertainment retail destinations. It was a strategy borrowed from his 7-Eleven playbook, applied to a fundamentally different business in a fundamentally different crisis. The results were immediate and brutal. Blockbuster Online's subscriber growth, which had been accelerating sharply under Total Access, went into reverse. The company stopped aggressively promoting the hybrid service. The features that had made it compelling, which were the in-store exchange and the free rental with every returned mail disc, were quietly pulled back to cut costs. Subscribers noticed, and then they left. By the end of 2007, Netflix had regained its momentum. By 2008, Netflix crossed 9 million subscribers. Blockbuster Online, which had briefly threatened to overtake them, was stagnating. Meanwhile, the store business continued to deteriorate. Blockbuster was closing locations throughout 2008 and into 2009, not in a strategic planned way, but in a reactive, desperate way that signals a company losing control of its own trajectory. In 2008 alone, Blockbuster closed more than 500 stores in the United States. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. Franchise owners who had invested their life savings into Blockbuster locations watched their businesses collapse. And the debt was still there. By 2009, Blockbuster was carrying approximately $900 million in long-term debt, and its interest payments were consuming cash it desperately needed to compete. Employees inside the company described the atmosphere during this period as one of slow-motion disbelief. People who had believed in Total Access, who had watched it work in real time, who had seen Netflix executives sweat, those people were now watching the strategy be dismantled piece by piece, replaced by a vision that felt like it belonged in a different decade. In 2009, Blockbuster attempted the last desperate pivot, announcing plans to enter the video-on-demand space and partnering with TiVo and various other platforms to offer digital streaming. But by this point, Netflix had already been streaming content since 2007. 2 years in the streaming world is not a gap you close with a press release. Netflix had the content deals, the technology infrastructure, and most importantly, the subscriber base that gave studios a reason to negotiate with them. In September 2010, Blockbuster filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It listed assets of $1.02 billion against liabilities of $1.46 billion. The company that had been once worth $8.4 billion was effectively insolvent. The bankruptcy filing itself became kind of a public autopsy. The documents revealed just how completely the business had deteriorated. Store count had fallen from a peak of over 9,000 to around 3,000. Revenue had dropped from $6 billion at the company's height to under $3 billion. The subscriber gap between Blockbuster Online and Netflix, which Total Access had briefly begun to close, was now a chasm. Netflix had 15 million subscribers. Blockbuster Online had somewhere in the range of 1.5 million. In April 2011, Dish Network acquired Blockbuster's assets out of bankruptcy for $320 million, a number that, given what Blockbuster had once been, felt less like a sale and more like a funeral. Dish made a brief attempt to revive the brand as a streaming service. It didn't work. By 2013, Dish had closed the remaining corporate-owned stores and quietly wound the whole thing down. The last Blockbuster in America, the one in Bend, Oregon, independently owned and operated by a woman named Sandy Harding, survived. It still survives today. People drive hours to take photos outside it. It rents Blockbuster-branded merchandise. It hosts slumber parties. It is, in its own strange way, beloved. But it is the only one, out of 9,000. Here's the uncomfortable truth that gets lost in the Blockbuster story. Disruption doesn't have to be fatal. Plenty of companies have faced the exact same situation, an entrenched physical model being eaten alive by a digital challenger, and survived it. Some of them even thrived. The difference was never really about technology. It was about whether leadership was willing to hurt itself on purpose before the market did it for them. Take Best Buy, for example. By 2012, Best Buy looked like the next Blockbuster. Amazon was destroying physical electronics retail. Customers were walking into Best Buy stores, scanning products with their phones, and then buying them cheaper on Amazon. The practice even had a name: showrooming. Best Buy's stock had lost roughly 50% of its value in a single year. Analysts were openly predicting its collapse, but Best Buy's CEO, Hubert Jolly, did something that required genuine courage. He didn't retreat from the stores, he reinvented what they were for. He struck deals with major brands, Samsung, Microsoft, Apple, to create branded experience sections inside Best Buy locations, turning the stores into showrooms that those brands actually paid for. He used the physical footprint as a fulfillment advantage, offering same-day delivery and in-store pickup at a time when Amazon couldn't match it. He cut costs aggressively but protected the customer experience. By 2013, Best Buy had stabilized. By 2016, it was growing again. It had taken a structural disadvantage, thousands of physical locations, and converted it into a competitive weapon. Sound familiar? That's exactly what Total Access was trying to do with Blockbuster stores. The difference is that Best Buy's board let Jolly execute. Then there's Netflix itself, which faced its own near-death moment in 2011 when it raised prices and split its DVD and streaming services into two separate products under the catastrophically ill-conceived Quickster rebrand. It lost 800,000 subscribers in a single quarter. Its stock dropped 75% from its peak. Reed Hastings publicly apologized. And then Netflix did what Blockbuster never could. It looked directly at where the world was going, admitted it had stumbled, reversed the Quickster decision, and then doubled down on streaming content with a ferocity that reshaped the entire entertainment industry. Netflix survived its crisis because its leadership had the institutional authority to make fast decisions, admit mistakes, and change course without a Carl Icahn dismantling everything from the inside. And then there's Redbox. Often overlooked in this story, Redbox was doing to Blockbuster's low-end casual rental customers exactly what Netflix was doing to its core subscriber, and doing it with a simplicity that was almost embarrassing. $1 a night, no membership, no late fees beyond the daily charge. By 2010, Redbox had 22,000 kiosks across the United States and was processing 1.5 million rentals per day. It had carved out the impulse rental market almost entirely. Blockbuster was being squeezed from both directions simultaneously. Netflix above, Redbox below, and responded to neither threat with speed or clarity. The metaphor that crystallizes it is simple. Netflix and Best Buy both understood that when the ground shifts beneath you, you don't stand still and wait to fall. You jump to the next surface before the current one you're standing on disappears. Blockbuster saw the next surface. Antioco had even built a bridge to it, but the bridge was being torn down by people on the same side as him, because they were more focused on this quarter's losses than next year's survival. The numbers tell part of the story, but the human cost is what makes them real. Start with the employees. At Blockbuster's peak, the company employed approximately 60,000 people in the United States alone. By the time Dish Network completed its acquisition and wound down the remaining stores in 2013, nearly all of those jobs were gone. 60,000 people, store managers, district supervisors, warehouse workers, most of whom had no advance warning that the company they'd built their career around was simply going to cease to exist. These weren't executives with golden parachutes. These were people making $10 to $15 an hour who showed up one day and were told to return their keys. The franchise owners were perhaps the most tragic dimension of the collapse. Unlike corporate employees, franchisees had invested their own money, in many cases their life savings, into Blockbuster locations. When the brand deteriorated and corporate support evaporated, they had no safety net. Many of them had signed long-term leases on retail space based on their projections. When Blockbuster filed for bankruptcy in September 2010, those franchisees were left holding leases, inventory, and a ton of debt. Some lost everything. Then there's John Antioco himself, the man who had seen the problem clearly, built a real solution, and then been forced out before he could finish the job. After leaving Blockbuster in 2007, Antioco largely disappeared from a public business conversation. He gave occasional interviews over the years, and in each one, there was a particular kind of controlled frustration. The frustration of someone who knows exactly where the wrong turn was made and has had years to think about it. In a 2013 interview with Fast Company, Antioco was direct. He said the decision to pull back from Total Access was, in his view, the moment the company's fate was sealed. He estimated that with continued investment in the hybrid model, Blockbuster could have reached 10 million online subscribers by 2008, a number that would have made the competitive picture against Netflix genuinely uncertain. We will never know if he was right, but the trajectory of Total Access before it was dismantled suggests he wasn't being delusional. Carl Icahn, for his part, eventually acknowledged that his role in Blockbuster's collapse had cost him money. He'd invested approximately $200 million in Blockbuster stock over his period of involvement. By the time the bankruptcy was finalized, that investment was essentially worthless. In a rare moment of candor, Icahn later listed Blockbuster as one of his worst investments. He didn't dwell on it publicly. Men like Carl Icahn rarely do. Jim Keyes left Blockbuster in 2010, just before the bankruptcy filing, and has maintained a relatively low profile since. He has never, to any significant public degree, engaged with the question of whether his strategic decisions accelerated the company's collapse. The Hollywood studios that had depended on Blockbuster as a primary distribution channel felt the shockwaves too. Blockbuster had been one of the largest buyers of physical media in the world. Its collapse contributed to the accelerating decline of the DVD market, a market that had generated $24 billion in revenue at its peak in 2004 and would fall to under $2 billion by the early 2020s. The studios didn't die, they pivoted to streaming. But the transition was painful, and Blockbuster's sudden absence made it more chaotic than it needed to be. And Netflix? By 2013, the year Blockbuster's last corporate stores closed, Netflix had 44 million subscribers worldwide and had just released its first original series, House of Cards, to critical acclaim. It was no longer just a DVD company or streaming service, it was becoming a studio. The company that had been laughed at in 2000 for being worth $50 million had a market capitalization by 2013 of approximately $20 billion. Step back and look at the full picture. A company with 60 million customers, 9,000 stores, and 60,000 employees was completely and totally destroyed, not by Netflix alone, but by a sequence of internal failures that compounded on each other with devastating precision. A board that prioritized short-term cost reduction over long-term survival, an investor who mistook aggression for strategy, a replacement CEO who didn't understand the business he'd been handed, and a window of genuine opportunity. Total Access, the hybrid model, the one moment Blockbuster had a real answer. That was open for perhaps 18 months before it was slammed shut from the inside. 18 months, that's all it was, and it was enough. There's a version of this story that gets told in business schools as a simple cautionary tale about disruption. The moral, in that version, is something clean and portable. Adapt or die. But that version isn't really honest, because Blockbuster did try to adapt. Antioco saw it coming. He built a response. The technology worked. The customers responded. Netflix was genuinely scared. So the real question this story forces you to sit with is, why didn't Blockbuster innovate? It's something harder and more uncomfortable than that. Why do companies destroy their own solutions? Because that's what actually happened here. Blockbuster didn't fail to find an answer. It found one. And then the people with the power inside the company, the board, the activist investor, the replacement CEO, all tore it apart because the answer was expensive and the future it pointed toward was uncertain. Carl Icahn looked at $400 million in lost late fee revenue and saw a catastrophe. What he couldn't see, or wouldn't see rather, was that the $400 million was already gone, that customers were already leaving, that the late fee model was already dying, and that the only question was whether Blockbuster would build something in its place or simply watch the revenue disappear without a replacement. This is a pattern that appears over and over in business history, and it never gets less tragic for how familiar it is. Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975 and buried it because it threatened film sales. Xerox developed the graphical user interface and the computer mouse at its Palo Alto Research Center in the 1970s. It failed to commercialize that too, leaving them for Apple and Microsoft to build empires on. Nokia's engineers were building touchscreen smartphones years before the iPhone, but Nokia's leadership couldn't reconcile the new product with the business model that was currently making them money. In each case, the company could see the future. They just couldn't survive the present long enough to get there. Not because the resources weren't there, but because of the internal politics, the short-term financial pressure, and the human instinct to protect what already exists made the transition impossible to complete. And that raises a question that goes beyond business strategy. It goes to something about how humans and the institutions humans build actually make decisions under pressure. We like to believe that good information leads to good decisions, that if you show people the data clearly enough, if the threat is real enough, and if the alternative is obvious enough, rational actors will do the rational thing. Blockbuster is proof that they won't. Not always, anyways. Not when there's money being lost in the short term. Not when there's an activist investor applying pressure. And not when the board is fractured and the CEO is exhausted. The one Blockbuster that remains, the one in Bend, Oregon, did a documentary about itself in 2020 called The Last Blockbuster. It became a cult hit. People watched it, not just out of nostalgia, but out of something that felt more like grief. Grief for a brand that had been genuinely woven into the fabric of Friday nights. That feeling is real, but it's also a little misleading, because the Blockbuster people are grieving wasn't destroyed by Netflix or streaming or by the march of technology. It was destroyed in a boardroom in a series of meetings by people who had the power to save it and chose not to. The store in Bend keeps its lights on. Sandy Harding still opens the doors every morning, people still come, and somewhere in the fact that the last Blockbuster on Earth survives as a kind of living museum, and a place where people visit to remember something that didn't have to end, there's a question worth sitting with. Not what killed Blockbuster, we know what killed Blockbuster, but what does it mean when the people inside it watched it happen and wouldn't stop it?